Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to sift through some really dense, important historical sources and pull out the essential insights for you. We look at the surprising details, the logistical headaches, and, well, the sheer boldness behind major events.
And today, we're tackling something huge. We're diving into the American Civil War, but focusing on a theater that, honestly, often gets overlooked.
That's right, we're talking about the Naval War, specifically the campaigns on the Gulf Coast and up the Mississippi River, a massive, sprawling conflict zone.
Absolutely critical to the outcome. Our guide for this is Captain A.T. Mahan's 1883 work, The Gulf and Inland Waters.
Which is foundational, really. Mahan wrote it about 20 years after the war, pulling together official reports, but also letters, personal accounts, getting perspectives from both sides.
It gives us this incredible blueprint of how the Union Navy used water power not just as support, but as a primary strategic tool to, well, essentially break the Confederacy.
So our mission today, we want you to understand the Union's massive two-pronged naval strategy out west.
First, there's the blockade. Enforcing a really strict blockade across, 1,600 miles of Gulf Coast?
And second, the campaign to actually seize control of the Mississippi River itself, all 1,100 miles of it. The goal being to literally cut the Confederacy in two.
Severing the Western resources from the Eastern armies. It's hard to overstate the importance.
And the scale. I mean, when you look at the map, the geography the Union faced is just staggering.
It really is. You're talking about the entire Gulf Coast, from Key West in Florida all the way over to the Rio Grande in Texas.
That's 1,600 miles of coastline, touching 5 Confederate states. Just maintaining a presence there is a huge undertaking.
And it wasn't easy coastline either. Mahan emphasizes this. Geographically, it's mostly low-lying, either sandy barrier islands or extensive marshland.
With very little tide, right? Only a foot or two.
Exactly. Which might sound minor, but it meant the whole character of the coast was different. Lots of shallow bays, inlets, bayous.
Perfect for small boats to slip through.
Precisely. Ideal for those light draft blockade runners. They could sneak in and out, trading cotton for absolutely essential war supplies. It made a traditional open sea blockade really difficult.
Okay, so let's dig into that Gulf Coast challenge first. Blockading 1,600 miles sounds, well, leaky at best. How did the Union even try to make it effective? What were the real goals beyond just stopping ships?
Well, Mahan makes it clear the Union strategy was inherently offensive. They weren't really worried about big Confederate warships coming out because, frankly, the South didn't have a significant seagoing navy.
So the goal was containment.
Containment and denial. Shut off every possible inlet, big or small, stop vital war supplies and basic civilian goods from getting in, and just as importantly, stop Southern products, mainly cotton and tobacco, from getting out to pay for those imports.
So if stopping access was the key, just patrolling miles offshore wasn't the most efficient way, was it?
No, not at all. Mahan points out the biggest leap in efficiency came when Union ships could actually get inside the harbors, or at least anchor right on the bar, controlling the entrance directly.
That puts the pressure right at the choke point.
Exactly. It drastically cut down the runners' chances and shifted the burden from endless, exhausting open sea patrolling to aggressively holding the key points.
You mentioned key points. New Orleans, Mobile, Galveston are the famous ones. But Mahan highlights Pensacola Bay as being really crucial, even though it wasn't a big commercial port. Why Pensacola?
Pensacola Bay, right there on the Florida-Alabama border, was just the best natural harbor on the entire Gulf Coast. Deep water, 22 feet over the bar, and really secure, spacious anchorage.
But not much trade going through it.
No, because the connections inland were poor at the time. But for the Navy, it was invaluable. It was already a pre-war naval station. Once the Union retook it, it became this essential base. Close to the Mississippi Delta, close to Mobile, it provided that logistical depth, a place to repair, refuel, resupply, which the Gulf Fleet desperately needed.
Okay, that sets the stage for the Gulf. But Mahan quickly pivots to the other massive challenge, the need for an inland navy. What made controlling the Mississippi River so absolutely vital beyond just military strategy?
This is where the politics really come in. Strategically, yes, seizing the Mississippi cuts the Confederacy in half. It denies the Eastern Confederate armies, like Lee's in Virginia, the food and supplies coming from states like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana.
The breadbasket, essentially.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But politically, controlling that river was, well, non-negotiable. It was essential to keep the powerful northwestern states happy. Think Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota. These states were booming.
And they saw the Mississippi as their highway to the world.
Absolutely. Their main commercial outlet. Mahan really stresses this political pressure. Lincoln's administration had to pursue the river campaign vigorously to maintain support for the war effort in those crucial states. It wasn't just a good idea, it was politically mandatory.
And beyond strategy and politics, the river system itself was just the best infrastructure available, wasn't it, in that vast, undeveloped interior?
Yes, definitely. Roads were poor, railroads were sparse, and often intentionally damaged. The Mississippi and its major tributaries, the Ohio, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, were ready-made highways. They allowed for relatively efficient transport of troops, heavy guns, ammunition, food, everything, deep into enemy territory.
Controlling that internal waterway was a massive logistical advantage.
Immense. But it required a completely different kind of navy, a specialized fleet of rivercraft that the Union simply didn't have when the war broke out.
Which brings us to the early days, 1861, and Mahan calls it the anomalous command structure, which sounds like a polite way of saying it was a total mess.
It really was a bureaucratic nightmare, born out of necessity and lack of preparation. The Navy Department was initially focused on the coastal blockade, so they split the Gulf Command 3 ways. Flag Officer Mervine got the main Gulf section, eventually having about 21 vessels by mid-1861.
But the real chaos was inland, on the rivers.
Yes, because the responsibility for building this new river fleet was given to the War Department, the Army.
Not the Navy. That seems counterintuitive.
Utterly. And it immediately caused problems. Naval officers assigned to build and command these river boats reported directly to Army generals. Mahan points this out as completely violating traditional naval practice, where commanders usually coordinate with other services, not report to them.
I can just imagine the friction. Career naval officers taking orders on shipbuilding and fleet operations from generals whose expertise is land warfare.
Exactly. Flag Officer Andrew Foote, who was initially tasked with organizing this flotilla, he complained bitterly about it. He started out with only the Army rank of colonel, and he said, quote, "Every brigadier could interfere with him."
Wow.
Mahan uses Foote's letters to emphasize how inefficient this was. You had Army commanders, who often didn't understand naval logistics or discipline, potentially countermanding the fleet commander's orders.
That's incredible. How did they even function in a combat zone under those conditions?
It's really a testament to the professionalism of those naval officers. They understood the mission's importance and, well, they swallowed their pride. Thankfully, this crazy setup finally ended in July 1862. The river fleet was officially transferred to the Navy Department, officers got their proper naval rank, and authority restored.
But those crucial early months when they were building the first ironclads and starting operations, that was all done under this incredibly awkward command structure.
Defined by that constant bureaucratic friction. It's amazing they achieved what they did.
So, given that urgency, the lack of ships, the command issues, the Union had to improvise immediately on the rivers. Before those famous Eads ironclads were ready, they started with converted wooden gunboats, right? The
Yeah.
Tyler, Lexington, Conestoga.
That's right. These were literally commercial river steamers bought right off the river. Their conversions were pretty basic, but focused on immediate survival needs.
What did they actually do to them?
Two main things. First, a really dangerous but necessary step. They moved the boilers down from the upper deck into the hold, trying to protect the steam engines from direct enemy fire.
Which must have made the engine rooms even hotter and more cramped.
Unbelievably so. Second, they added 5-inch thick oak bulwarks vertically around the main deck.
5 inches of oak? That doesn't sound like much protection against cannon fire.
It wasn't meant to be. Mahan notes it made them musketry-proof. That was the immediate threat, Confederate sharpshooters firing from the riverbanks, harassing the boats constantly. It offered basically zero protection against artillery.
Still, they were the first ones out there.
Yeah, they served a crucial early role, skirmishing, reconnaissance, convoy duty, though Mahan mentions they were constantly hampered by low water levels, which was just a perennial problem on those western rivers.
Okay, so the wooding boats were a stopgap. The real long-term solution needed armor. And that brings us to James B. Eads in St. Louis. August 1861, he gets the contract to build 7 ironclads. These become the famous turtle ships.
Right. The Cairo, Cornwall, Cincinnati, Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. These 7, plus a bigger converted snag boat called the Benton, really formed the core of the Union's fighting power on the upper Mississippi.
What were they like? They look so strange in drawings.
They were a unique design, dictated entirely by the river environment. Basically 175-foot-long, flat-bottomed scows. They had to have a shallow draft, maybe 6 or 7 feet, to navigate the rivers.
And the angled sides. The casemate.
That was key. The central paddle wheel was enclosed and protected by this casemate structure, with sides that sloped inwards at a really steep 45-degree angle. The idea was to deflect plunging shots coming from higher riverbanks.
And they were designed to fight head-on.
Absolutely. Mahan stresses this. The front end of the casemate, the bow section, had the thickest armor. 2.5 inches of iron plating, backed by 24 inches of solid oak. That's where the main offensive guns were.
But the rest of the ship wasn't as protected.
Not nearly. The sides had thinner armor, and the stern. Mahan calls it perfectly vulnerable. If they had to retreat or got caught from behind, they were in serious trouble. They were built for aggressive, forward movement. Attack, attack, attack.
And the guns they carried. You mentioned this reflects the chaos of the early war effort. They used whatever they could get their hands on.
Yeah, this is a really telling detail Mahan focuses on. It shows the lack of preparedness. The Army provided 35 old 42-pounder cannons, standard smoothbores.
But they modified them.
They rifled them, cut grooves inside the barrels to make the shells spin, hoping to increase range and accuracy. This allowed them to fire a heavier 70-pound explosive shell instead of the original 42-pound solid shot.
Sounds like an upgrade, but there was a catch.
A huge catch.
Yeah.
Rifling removed metal from inside the barrel, weakening it. And they were now firing shells almost double the original weight, creating much higher pressures. Mahan points out the obvious result.
The gun started exploding.
Regularly. Can you imagine? The crews, Mahan says, viewed these rifled 42s distrustfully at every fire. Standing next to a massive cannon, knowing it might just blow up when you fire it, it's horrific.
What other guns did they have?
They supplemented these dangerous 42s with some more reliable 1/8-inch shell guns and some old 32-pounder smoothbores. So each boat had this mixed battery of about 13 guns, mostly facing forward or to the sides.
And then there was the Benton. It wasn't one of the Eads boats, right? It was converted.
Right, the Benton was kind of the flagship, the old warhorse of the fleet. She was originally a powerful twin-hulled snag boat designed for clearing debris from the river.
Oh.
Eads converted her.
Bigger and stronger.
Yeah, double the size of the Turtles, about 1,000 tons. And heavier armor, especially on the bow, 3 inches of iron backed by 30 inches of oak. Arguably the most powerful vessel they had early on.
She had a weakness.
A critical one.
Yeah.
She was incredibly slow. Mahan says she could only make about 5 knots. Foote actually hesitated to accept her because he worried her slowness would hold back the entire flotilla during operations.
So building these improvised ironclads was one challenge. Manning them must have been another nightmare entirely. Where did they find the crews? Thousands of sailors needed for this brand new river fleet.
It was a massive ongoing problem. Mahan highlights the constant lack of money and, more importantly, trained personnel. The crews were this incredible mix.
A real melting pot.
Yet a small core of experienced sailors from the regular Navy, some merchant seamen maybe from the coast, then Western Rivermen guys who knew the Mississippi like the back of their hand, but had zero naval discipline.
And drafts from the Army.
Yes, and this was a major source of frustration. Foote complained that Army commanders, understandably perhaps, tended to send their worst men when they got a draft order. The troublemakers, the poorly disciplined, the untrained.
So the ship's officers were dealing with this incredibly mixed bag.
Often, the commanding officer was the only commissioned naval officer on board. He had this monumental task of taking this diverse, sometimes unwilling group and forging them into a disciplined, effective fighting crew, often while under fire.
Drilling them on guns that might explode.
Exactly. Mahan really gives credit to the officers' leadership. He suggests the eventual success came more from their ability to impose order and train these crews than from the technology itself, which was often flawed.
One last bit of tech before we move upriver. Confederate torpedoes. We're not talking about modern torpedoes here, are we?
No, not at all. These were primitive but terrifyingly effective mines. The earliest ones Mahan describes were literally just demijohns, large glass jugs filled with gunpowder.
How did they set them off?
With simple friction primers, triggered by contact. Mahan notes that at the time, using torpedoes was barely considered a respectable mode of warfare by many professional sailors. It seemed underhanded, almost cowardly.
Like booby traps rather than open combat.
Kind of. But these crude devices worked. They could and did sink powerful ironclads. We'll see a prime example later with the loss of the USS Cairo. They created fear and uncertainty, a potent psychological weapon.
Okay, so the Union forces are gathering at Cairo, Illinois, the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Their first major offensive wasn't actually down the Mississippi itself, was it? It was up The tributaries, the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers.
That's right. This is the strategic thrust into Tennessee in early 1862. The targets were Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. Capturing these would open up central Tennessee.
The attack on Fort Henry, how did that go? This was the first real test for the Eads Ironclads.
It really was. Flag Officer Foote led the assault. He used the Ironclads' main strength, their heavily armored bows and forward-facing guns. He advanced them in a line abreast, bows towards the fort.
And he used a specific tactic regarding range.
Yes, a very clever one for river fighting. He kept the line constantly moving, either advancing slowly or dropping back slightly. This continually altered the range to the fort's guns.
Why was that so important?
Because the Confederate cannons were mostly in fixed positions. Their elevation was set for a specific distance. By constantly changing his own range, Foote made it incredibly difficult for the Confederate gunners to get accurate shots. They'd fire too high or too low. Meanwhile, his ironclads kept pounding away with their bow guns. It perfectly showcased the design concept, compensating for the weaknesses in their own armament.
But even with that smart tactic, things could go wrong catastrophically, like what happened to the USS Essex.
Oh, absolutely. A single unlucky shot could be devastating. During the Fort Henry fight, a Confederate shell managed to penetrate the Essex's casemate armor.
Not just penetrate, it went right through the fighting compartment.
Yes, ranged aft, and then struck the middle boiler. Mahan describes the result vividly, a massive, instantaneous release of high-pressure steam.
Scalding hot steam filling that confined space.
It scalded nearly everyone in the forward part of the ship, including the commander and the pilots. Men were forced to leap overboard just to escape being boiled alive. The Essex was instantly disabled, drifting helplessly out of the fight.
A brutal reminder of the vulnerability of steam power.
Definitely. Protected from shells? Maybe. But a hit to the engine or boiler was catastrophic. Still, the other three ironclads pressed the attack, and Fort Henry surrendered fairly quickly after that.
Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, though, that was a different story, a much tougher fight.
Much tougher. The main Confederate batteries at Donelson weren't at water level like Henry. They were positioned high up on a bluff, about 100 feet above the river.
Giving them a plunging angle of fire onto the decks of the gunboats.
Exactly. The fleet used the same formation, advancing bows on, closing to within about 400 yards. But the elevated position of the Confederate guns made a huge difference. Their shots were hitting the weaker deck armor and superstructure.
The fight was intense.
Very. Mahan says the fleet fought obstinately, and they actually felt they were gaining the upper hand, silencing some guns. But then disaster struck almost simultaneously for two key vessels.
The flagship St. Louis and the Louisville.
Yes. Both ships had their steering mechanism shot away. The St. Louis lost its wheel, the Louisville its tiller ropes.
In a fast river current, losing steering is fatal.
Completely disabling. They became unmanageable, basically just targets drifting helplessly downriver. The Confederates saw this, immediately manned their guns again, and poured heavy fire into the retreating, crippled vessels. Foote had no choice but to order a withdrawal. The naval assault had failed.
Though the Army did eventually capture Fort Donelson after a siege.
Right, it was an Army victory, but the naval component was repulsed. And a significant consequence for the fleet was Flag Officer Foote himself being wounded.
Not seriously, initially.
No, just splinters in his arm and foot from enemy fire hitting the pilot house. But Mahan notes that Foote, being the driving force behind the whole river campaign, never really gave it time to heal properly. The constant strain, the exposure, it became a chronic wound.
A wound that would eventually force him out of command.
Sadly, yes. It plagued him for months.
After the successes on the tributaries, the focus shifted back to the main Mississippi Channel. The next big obstacle was Island Number 10. Why was this location so difficult?
Geography. Pure and simple. The river there does this crazy double bend, like an inverted S. This allowed the Confederates to place fortifications that could fire on ships approaching from multiple angles. Plus, the surrounding terrain on the Tennessee side was vast, impassable swamp, making a land assault or escape very difficult.
And Foote seemed reluctant to attack it head-on after the Donelson experience.
He was definitely more cautious. He maintained a long-range bombardment about 2,000 yards for nearly a month. Mahan says Foote had learned two hard lessons at Donelson.
Which were?
First, the swift current meant a disabled ship would be swept right down into enemy hands, guaranteed capture. Second, he was acutely aware of the vulnerability of the ironclad's unarmored sides and sterns if they got too close to concentrated batteries. So he played it safe, kept his distance. The bombardment harassed the Confederates but didn't force a surrender.
So the stalemate needed a different approach. Ingenuity was required.
And it came in two forms. First, the Army under General Pope did something remarkable. They dug a canal across the neck of land on the Missouri side, bypassing the island's batteries entirely. This allowed transports and lighter vessels to get downstream.
But the ironclads couldn't use the canal.
No, too deep a draft. So the second part was naval daring. Commander Henry Walk, captain of the Carondelet, volunteered to run the batteries at night.
A solo run. That sounds incredibly risky. How did they prepare the ship?
Mahan details the preparations. Walk lashed an empty coal barge alongside the Carondelet for extra protection. They piled bales of hay and timber around vulnerable areas, especially the stern. They even ran extra ropes and cables to hold everything down.
And the weather helped.
Immensely. A massive thunderstorm broke out just as they started their run. The thunder, lightning, and rain helped mask the noise and sight of the ship slipping past the forts. It was a terrifying but successful passage.
And the Pittsburgh followed later.
Yes. Having those two ironclads below the island was the key. They could now cover the Army's crossing of the river, effectively cutting off Island No. 10 completely. The garrison surrendered soon after, on April 7, 1862.
A major victory, achieved through engineering and bravery, rather than just firepower.
Absolutely. But shortly after this, in May 1862, Foote's lingering wound from Donelson finally forced him to relinquish command. It really marked the end of a distinguished phase, Foote having organized and led the flotilla through its earliest critical victories.
His successor, Captain Charles H. Davis, immediately faced a new kind of Confederate threat, didn't he? The River Defense Fleet.
Yes, this was a Confederate improvisation. They took about 8 commercial steamers, strengthened their bows, protected their engines somewhat, and essentially turned them into rams. They weren't well armed, but they were designed for one thing: smashing into the Union ironclads.
Their first major action was the attack at Plum Point, near Fort Pillow.
Right. The Confederate plan was actually pretty good, a surprise dash to hit the Union gunboats while they were anchored or unprepared. Mahan credits them with dash and spirit, but highlights their fatal flaw: a complete lack of coordination and naval discipline.
So they attacked piecemeal.
Pretty much. While the Union ironclads were scrambling to get steam up and raise anchor, the USS Cincinnati found herself isolated and unsupported for almost half an hour.
And the Confederate rams converged on her.
The General Bragg struck her hard, followed by the General Sterling Price. The Cincinnati managed to get a broadside off that damaged the Price, but the ramming was too severe. She sank in shallow water. The Mound City was also rammed and disabled.
So the rams were effective.
Tactically, yes, in that moment. But strategically, the attack failed. The rams didn't support each other effectively. They sank 2 Union boats but didn't press the advantage to destroy the whole flotilla. The Union response was disorganized too, but the lack of Confederate coordination meant the threat was contained.
Lessons learned for the next encounter, which came quickly at Memphis.
Yes. About a month later, the Battle of Memphis was the final stand for the Confederate River Defense Fleet. And this time, the Union had their own rams ready, commanded by Colonel Charles Ellet, Jr.
These were Army rams, weren't they? Part of that weird command structure still.
Technically, yes, though Ellet operated with more autonomy. His rams, the Queen of the West and the Monarch, were faster and, crucially, better coordinated.
How did the battle unfold?
It was a wild melee fought right in front of the city of Memphis. The Queen of the West boldly steamed right through the line of Union ironclads to engage the Confederate rams directly.
Yeah.
She rammed and sank the Confederate Colonel Lovell almost immediately.
Creating chaos.
Total chaos. The Monarch then rammed the General Beauregard. As the Beauregard reeled from the impact, the slow but powerful ironclad Benton steamed up and finished her off with a shell straight into the boilers. Mahan describes the horrific scene of scalded crewmen leaping into the river.
A decisive Union victory.
Absolutely. 7 out of the 8 Confederate vessels were either captured or destroyed. With their river fleet gone, Memphis surrendered shortly after Fort Pillow was evacuated.
And this cleared the upper Mississippi down to Vicksburg. So by July 1st, 1862, Captain Davis's flotilla moving downriver finally met forces coming upriver from the Gulf.
Yes, they joined hands with Admiral Farragut's fleet, which had achieved its own stunning victory further south. That meeting above Vicksburg marked the beginning of the next great phase, the long struggle for the main Confederate stronghold on the river. Right, while Foote and Davis were fighting their way down the tributaries and the upper Mississippi, a whole separate campaign was unfolding from the south, led by David G. Farragut. His objective: forced the Mississippi open from the Gulf of Mexico upwards, starting with the capture of New Orleans.
But Farragut's fleet was very different from the river ironclads, wasn't it? He had ocean-going warships. Mahan seems to suggest they weren't really suited for river fighting.
He does, and it's a crucial point. Farragut's fleet was composed of powerful screw sloops, ships like his flagship Hartford, the Brooklyn, the Richmond, plus smaller corvettes and gunboats. 17 vessels in total, carrying 154 heavy guns. Powerful ships.
Well, but designed for the open sea. What was the problem on a river?
Their armament configuration. Mahan calculates that nearly 90% of their heavy guns were mounted in broadside, perfect for fighting another ship side by side on the ocean.
But not for attacking forts head-on.
Exactly. Steaming up a narrow winding river towards fixed fortifications, they could often only bring maybe 60% of their guns to bear at any one time. And critically, Mahan stresses, none of their heaviest guns could fire straight ahead. They were incredibly vulnerable when approaching fortifications bows on, which is precisely how the Confederate river forts were designed to be engaged.
A major limitation. And the defenses protecting New Orleans were formidable, right? Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip.
Very formidable. Located about 90 miles below the city at a sharp bend in the river called Plaquemine Bend. Fort Jackson was a large pentagonal brick fort with casemated guns. St. Philip was an older brick and earthwork fort. They were only about 800 yards apart, creating a deadly crossfire zone covering the river bend.
So how did the Union plan to tackle them, not just sail straight up?
No, the first step was a massive bombardment, intended to soften them up or even force their surrender. This was handled by Commander David Dixon Porter's mortar flotilla.
Mortars, like siege weapons.
Exactly. Porter had 20 schooners, each armed with a single enormous 13th-inch seacoast mortar. These things threw a 285-pound explosive shell in a high arc.
Fired from ships.
Yes. The schooners were basically just floating platforms for these huge mortars. They anchored downstream, partially hidden by trees, and maintained a relentless bombardment day and night for 6 straight days.
Did it work? Did it destroy the forts?
Mahan says Confederate accounts were unanimous about the singular accuracy of the mortar fire.
Yeah.
It was terrifying for the garrison. It destroyed barracks and buildings inside the forts, threatened the main powder magazine in Fort Jackson, and made life utterly miserable. The garrison was forced to live in the damp, partially flooded lower casemates, but it didn't actually breach the main defenses or force the forts to surrender.
So the bombardment harassed them, but didn't eliminate the threat. What about physical obstructions in the river?
That was the other key part of the defense. The Confederates knew they needed to stop or slow down any attacking ships right under the fort's guns. They'd initially tried a barrier of cypress logs and chains, but the strong river current and floods had broken it.
So they built something stronger.
Yes. They replaced it with a line of anchored hulks, old schooners chained together across the channel. This was designed specifically to snag any approaching warships, holding them stationary in that kill zone between the forts. If the Union ship got hung up on that chain, it was likely doomed.
So Farragut's whole plan depended on whether that barrier was still intact when he made his run.
Absolutely critical. And finding out required incredible bravery. Lieutenant Charles Caldwell led a small boat crew on a nighttime reconnaissance mission. Pitch black, right under the guns of the forts.
What did they find?
They rode right up to the line of hulks. The Confederates had lit a fire on the shore, ironically trying to illuminate any approaching boats, but the glare actually helped Caldwell navigate. He discovered that the river's current had again put too much strain on the chains holding the hulks. They'd snapped in one section, creating what he reported as a broad open space.
The barrier was breached?
Yes, that piece of intelligence was gold. Mahan even quotes the Confederate engineer in charge, who later admitted, while the obstruction existed, the city was safe. When it was swept away, it was in the enemy's power. Caldwell's daring mission opened the door.
So Farragut gave the order to go. When did the assault start?
In the pre-dawn darkness, around 3:30 a.m. on April 24, 1862, the fleet advanced in 2 columns, trying to use the darkness as cover.
But it quickly turned chaotic.
Almost immediately, Farragut's flagship, the Hartford, leading one column, steered close to Fort Jackson. Suddenly, a small Confederate tugboat, the Mosher, darted out, pushing a huge burning fire raft right alongside the Hartford.
A fire raft, like a barge loaded with burning material.
Exactly. The Hartford was forced to maneuver sharply to avoid it, ran aground briefly right under the guns of Fort St. Philip, and the ship actually caught fire from the raft.
Under fire and on fire. Disaster.
It looked like it for a moment, but Mahan praises the incredible discipline of the Hartford's crew. They put out the flames while still under heavy fire, got the ship off the mudbank, and pushed on through the gauntlet.
What about the tugboat, the Mosher?
It was an incredibly brave, almost suicidal attack. Mahan notes the little tug, with maybe half a dozen crew, was riddled by the Hartford's guns and sank almost immediately after pushing the raft alongside. A desperate act of defiance.
Did all the Union ships make it past the forts?
Not all of them. The passage took about an hour and a quarter of intense fighting in the dark. 13 of the larger Union warships successfully got past the forts. But some of the smaller gunboats in the rear, like the Itasca, Winona, and Kennebec, got tangled in the remnants of the chain obstruction.
And by then, the sun was coming up.
Right. Dawn broke, silhouetting them against the morning sky. They became perfect targets for the fort's gunners, took heavy damage, and were forced to retreat back downriver. The Itasca, for instance, took a shot through her boilers and was completely disabled.
So 13 ships got through. Was the fighting over them?
Not quite. There was a small Confederate flotilla waiting above the forts, mostly converted river steamers and a couple of small ironclads, including the ram Manassas. A short, vicious fight erupted.
This is where the USS Varuna met her end.
Yes, the Varuna, one of the faster Union gunboats, had steamed ahead of the main fleet. She got into a tangled fight with the Confederate steamer Governor Moore. The Moore managed to ram the Varuna twice. Yes, the Varuna was going down fast. But Mahan recounts this amazing story of defiance. Even as she sank, the Varuna kept firing devastating broadsides that essentially wiped out the Moore's crew. Her commander, Captain Boggs, even ordered his gunners to fire a shell through the bow of his own sinking ship at the enemy alongside. Talk about fighting to the last breath.
Incredible. So, after that final fight, the way to New Orleans was open.
Essentially, yes. The Confederate fleet was destroyed or scattered. New Orleans surrendered soon after Farragut's fleet appeared before the city.
And eventually, Farragut's fleet pushed further upriver to meet Davis's flotilla coming down.
Right. They joined forces above Vicksburg by July 1st, 1862. Farragut proved he could run past Vicksburg's batteries, too. He famously said he could pass them as often as necessary.
But he also recognized the limitation of naval power alone against a fortified city on high bluffs.
Absolutely. He reported back immediately that without a significant land army to occupy the surrounding territory, the Navy could silence Vicksburg's guns temporarily, maybe run past them, but they couldn't reduce the fortress. They couldn't capture and hold it. That realization set the stage for the long, grinding Vicksburg campaign.
Okay, so the Union fleets meet above Vicksburg in the summer of 1862. The Mississippi is open, except for that crucial stretch between Vicksburg and Port Hudson downriver. But immediately, a new Confederate threat emerges that really plays on the weaknesses of the Union riverboats. The ironclad CSS Arkansas.
Yes, the Arkansas was a serious problem. Built up the Yazoo River, she was reasonably well armored for the time, and she exploited the key weakness of the Union ironclads, their vulnerable sterns.
How did that play out?
Well, in her first major encounter, she met the USS Carondelet. The Carondelet tried to fight while retreating downstream. Mahan calls this decision not judicious. By turning stern to, the Carondelet exposed her unarmored rear, could only fire her two weak stern guns.
While the Arkansas could use her heavier bow guns against that weak spot.
Exactly. The Carondelet was badly damaged and barely managed to escape. The Arkansas then boldly ran through the entire anchored Union fleet above Vicksburg, taking hits but causing chaos and proving she could stand up to them. It was a major psychological blow.
And this threat, combined with other factors, led to a major Union withdrawal later that summer.
Yes, it was a combination of the Arkansas threat, the steadily falling water levels in the Mississippi making navigation hazardous for the deep-draft seagoing ships, and rampant sickness.
Sickness was that bad?
Devastating. Mahan reports that by late July, nearly 40% of the crews in the upper river flotilla were sick with malaria, dysentery, and other climatic diseases. The heat, the bad water, the mosquitoes. It was brutal.
So the fleets pulled back.
They had to. Farragut took his seagoing ships back down to New Orleans. Davis took the river ironclads north to Helena, Arkansas, a healthier location.
What was the consequence of that withdrawal?
It was strategically disastrous in the short term. It meant the Confederates regained undisputed control of the Mississippi River between Vicksburg and Port Hudson. This allowed them to freely transport supplies and communicate across the river, particularly using the Red River and Atchafalaya Basin as corridors to bring vital food from Texas and Louisiana eastwards. Closing that gap became the primary objective.
So when the campaign resumed, the Union Navy had learned some hard lessons and started developing new types of vessels, specifically for river warfare.
Yes, they realized they needed specialized tools. One innovation was the tin-clad or light draft gunboat.
Tin-clad. Sounds flimsy.
These were basically existing commercial stern-wheel river steamers, the kind that could navigate really shallow water. They were covered with very thin iron plating, maybe half an inch to three-quarters of an inch thick.
Just enough to stop bullets.
Exactly. Mahan says they were strictly musketry-proof, offering no real protection against artillery. But they were perfect for patrolling narrow, winding bayous and tributaries, dealing with Confederate guerrillas and sharpshooters firing from behind in trees, what they call bushwhacking warfare. Their incredibly shallow draft, sometimes only 18-20 inches when light, let them gird places the heavy ironclads couldn't.
Did they also try to build better heavy ironclads for the main river?
They did. Ships like the Tuscumbia, Indianola, Choctaw, and Lafayette were built or converted around this time. They featured much heavier armor. The Tuscumbia supposedly had 6 inches on her bow casemate.
But Mahan suggests they weren't entirely successful.
He points out a paradox. While they had learned the need for heavy armor, the actual construction, often done quickly in inland yards without established naval standards, was sometimes weakly built. Hulls weren't strong enough, engines were inefficient. They showed the problems of trying to rapidly build complex warships from scratch during wartime.
And primitive weapons could still be deadly. The loss of the USS Cairo proved that.
Tragically, yes. In December 1862, while the fleet was trying to clear Confederate torpedoes from the Yazoo River ahead of a planned Army assault, the Cairo struck one of those simple demijohn mines.
Ignited by a friction primer.
That's right, a primitive device, but it blew a huge hole in the Cairo's hull. She sank in minutes, thankfully without much loss of life, as she was in shallow water. But it was a stark reminder of the constant danger posed by these hidden threats. You can actually see the raised and restored Cairo today at Vicksburg National Military Park.
The setbacks continued into early 1863. The loss of the new ironclad Indianola was a major blow, wasn't it?
It really was. The Indianola had successfully run past the Vicksburg batteries heading downstream. Admiral Porter was elated. He thought he now controlled the river below Vicksburg.
But the Confederates counterattacked.
Yes, with rams again. The captured Union ram Queen of the West, which had been captured earlier, and the Confederate ram Webb attacked the Indianola at night. The Indianola was powerful, but slower.
She fought back.
She resisted several ramming attempts. Mahan says she took 5 major blows. But a final, powerful ramming by the Webb crushed her stern, disabled her rudder and engines, and started her timbers leaking badly. Hopelessly crippled, her commander was forced to surrender her.
So much for controlling the river below Vicksburg.
Exactly. It was a short-lived victory, followed by a demoralizing defeat, showing just how dangerous those Confederate rams could be, especially at night, against isolated vessels.
Around this time, Grant and Porter were also attempting those flanking maneuvers through the bayous, trying to get troops below Vicksburg without running the main batteries. Mahan paints a picture of just miserable, exhausting work.
Oh, these bayou expeditions were nightmares. Not glorious naval battles, but grinding struggles against nature and terrain. The Yazoo Pass expedition, for instance, involved cutting the Mississippi Levee near Helena, Arkansas, to flood an old channel leading towards the Yazoo River above Vicksburg.
What were the conditions like for the ships?
Incredibly difficult. The channel was narrow, choked with cypress trees and submerged logs. Mahan describes the forest forming a complete arch over the stream in places. Ships were constantly grappling with overhanging branches above and hidden snags below. The heavy ironclads, drawing 9 feet of water, were just fundamentally unsuited for these tight, twisting waterways.
And Admiral Porter led another expedition himself, through Steele's Bayou. Was that any better?
If anything, it was worse. Porter took 5 ironclads up Steele's Bayou, trying to reach the Yazoo via Deer Creek. They encountered deliberately sunken coal barges blocking the narrow channel, dense overhanging trees that snagged smokestacks, and constant harassment from Confederate sharpshooters hidden in the thick undergrowth along the banks.
They got trapped, didn't they?
Completely stuck at one point. The channel was so narrow they couldn't turn around. They had to painstakingly back the entire line of ironclads out. It got so bad, Mahan notes, that General Sherman had to rush troops overland to secure the banks and prevent Confederate infantry from capturing the immobilized, helpless warships.
It really highlights how different river warfare was. The Army basically had to rescue the Navy from the jungle.
Pretty much. It showed a failure of high-level planning to really account for the on-the-ground realities of the terrain and hydrology. These flanking attempts failed, costing immense effort and time.
So, with the bayou routes blocked, Grant decided he had no choice but to march his army down the Louisiana side and cross the river below Vicksburg, which meant he needed the Navy to run the batteries again, this time to get transports and supply barges past the city.
Right. This was the big run in April 1863. Porter had to provide cover and get the essential transport vessels through, and they prepared meticulously, having learned harsh lessons about vulnerability.
How did they protect the ships this time, especially those weak sterns?
They piled bales of wet hay and cotton around the engines and boilers. They slung heavy logs along the sides near the waterline to absorb hits. But the most significant protection, Mahan emphasizes, was lashing huge coal barges alongside each ironclad, specifically on the starboard side, which would face Vicksburg's guns.
Why coal barges?
Two reasons. It guaranteed a fuel supply for the long passage and subsequent operations below Vicksburg, and the several feet of coal and wood acted as an extra layer of ablative armor, absorbing shell impacts before they reached the ship's hull.
Clever. But the passage itself wasn't smooth sailing, despite the prep?
No, almost immediately there was confusion. The Confederates set a house on the Louisiana shore ablaze, hoping the glare would illuminate the Union fleet for their gunners.
Did it work?
Ironically, it backfired, but not in the way the Confederates hoped. Mahan says the intense glare blinded the Union pilots, making it almost impossible to see the river channel properly. Several ships, including the Lafayette and Carondelet, lost their bearings and made involuntary circles in the current right under the heaviest batteries, prolonging their exposure.
Incredible tension. Did the logs and barges help?
They absolutely saved ships. Mahan recounts how the Pittsburgh took a direct hit near the stern, close to her powder magazine. The shot struck one of the heavy logs slung alongside. The log splintered, absorbing the impact and preventing the shell from penetrating the hull. Without that simple log, the ship might have exploded.
Almost all the vessels made it through, though damaged. But the Navy suffered another significant loss just before the final siege began, didn't they? The USS Cincinnati.
Yes, this was in late May 1863, during the preliminary assaults on the Vicksburg defenses. The Cincinnati was sent on a very specific, very dangerous mission: to steam close inshore and use her guns to suppress Confederate rifle pits that were harassing the Army's flank.
Essentially drawing fire upon herself.
It was a calculated sacrifice. As she rounded into position, Mahan says she was immediately hit by multiple heavy cannons firing from concealed positions at near point-blank range. Two shots tore through her hull below the waterline, another hit the magazine causing flooding, and a heavy shell smashed the pilot house. She was doomed almost instantly.
But there was that act of incredible bravery as she went down.
Yes, Mahan makes a point of highlighting it. Quartermaster Frank Boy. As the ship was sinking rapidly under that intense fire, all three of her flagstaffs were shot away. Boy went out onto the exposed deck, somehow found a spare flag, and calmly nailed it to the stump of the forward staff.
Defiance to the very end.
An astonishing act of courage and symbolism. He ensured the ship went down with her colors flying. It captured the spirit of the fleet's endurance during that long, brutal campaign.
So by the end of May, Vicksburg was surrounded. Grant's army had crossed the river and invested the city from the land side. What was the Navy's main role during the siege itself?
Mahan emphasizes their indispensable role in keeping Grant's communications and supply lines open via the river. Without the Navy controlling the waterway below Vicksburg, Grant's army would have been cut off and starved out.
Did they contribute directly to the siege bombardment?
Yes, significantly. Since the fleet had limited ability to elevate their guns to hit the city effectively from the river, they landed heavy artillery pieces from the ships. 13 massive cannons, IX-inch Dahlgrens, heavy rifles, 32-pounders were hauled ashore and put into siege batteries manned by Navy sailors. These naval guns added crucial firepower to the land bombardment.
A true combined arms effort.
Absolutely. The fall of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, followed a few days later by the surrender of Port Hudson further south, was the result of relentless pressure from both the Army and the Navy. It finally achieved that great strategic objective. The Mississippi River was open, and the Confederacy was cut in two.
With the Mississippi secured, the Union focus shifted back to tightening the blockade on the Gulf Coast. A year after Vicksburg, in August 1864, Admiral Farragut targets the most heavily fortified Confederate port remaining, Mobile Bay, Alabama. Mahan presents this battle as a real technological showdown.
It really was. The defenses were centered on two major forts guarding the main entrance: Fort Morgan on the eastern side, Fort Gaines on Dauphin Island to the west.
But the biggest threat wasn't necessarily the forts, was it? It was a new Confederate ironclad.
Exactly, the CSS Tennessee. Mahan describes her as the most powerful ironclad warship actually built from the keel up by the Confederacy. Her construction itself was an incredible feat, sourcing iron plating from mines deep in the Alabama interior.
What made her so formidable?
She was heavily armored 6 inches of iron on her forward casemate, backed by 25 inches of solid wood, and she carried powerful Brook rifles capable of firing 110-pound shells. She was designed to be an almost invulnerable floating fortress.
But like the earlier ironclads, she had weaknesses.
Yes, 2 critical ones Mahan points out. First, she was very slow, only about 6 knots maximum speed, a powerful punch, but she couldn't easily chase down faster wooden ships. Second, and this Mahan calls a culpable oversight in her design, her steering chains ran in exposed trenches on top of the armored deck behind the casemate.
Not protected underneath.
No. Which meant her steering was potentially vulnerable to being severed by enemy fire, even relatively light fire, potentially leaving her unmanageable.
Yeah.
A huge design flaw.
And the entrance to Mobile Bay was also protected by obstructions, including torpedoes.
Heavily obstructed.
Mm-hmm.
Besides sunken piles, the Confederates had laid a triple line of naval mines and torpedoes across the main ship channel. And these weren't the crude demijohns used earlier. Mahan describes them as more sophisticated contact mines. Tin cones filled with powder, triggered by sensitive primers. Some might have even been electrically detonated, though most were contact fuses.
A minefield, essentially.
Yes. They deliberately left only a narrow, clear passage close under the guns of Fort Morgan, mainly for blockade runners to slip through. That narrow channel was the path Farragut's fleet had to take to get into the bay.
What was Farragut's plan of attack? How did he intend to deal with the forts, the Tennessee, and the minefield?
His plan was bold. He decided to lead with his 4 monitor ships, like the Tecumseh and Manhattan. These were heavily armored, low-profile vessels with guns and rotating turrets. Their job was to steam close to Fort Morgan and engage its guns directly, absorbing the punishment.
And the rest of the fleet? The wooden ships?
They would follow the monitors, lash together in pairs a heavy screw sloop like the Hartford, paired with the smaller, faster gunboat like the Metacomet.
Why lash them together?
For mutual support. If one ship's engine was disabled by enemy fire, its partner could help tow it through the channel. If one lost steering, the other could help guide it. It also concentrated firepower and provided some protection to the smaller vessel.
So the monitors lead, the paired wooden ships follow, all heading for that narrow channel past Fort Morgan. What happened?
Disaster struck almost immediately. The lead monitor, USS Tecumseh, commanded by Tunis Craven, was supposed to pass to the west of a specific channel buoy, keeping Fort Morgan to starboard. But either trying to engage the Tennessee directly or misjudging his position, Craven steered the Tecumseh slightly east of the buoy.
Straight into the known torpedo field.
Directly into it. She struck a torpedo. Mahan says the explosion was immense. The Tecumseh lurched violently and sank almost instantly, bow first. Only about 21 of her crew of over 110 survived.
Gone in seconds, witnessed by the entire fleet following behind her.
The psychological impact was huge. Imagine seeing that happen right in front of you. The captain of the next ship in line, the USS Brooklyn, immediately stopped and backed his engines, shouting the warning, "Torpedoes ahead!" The whole Union battle line hesitated, right under the guns of Fort Morgan.
This is the moment for Farragut's famous order.
This is it. Farragut, lashed high in the rigging of the Hartford for a better view, saw the line faltering. He demanded to know the problem. Hearing torpedoes, he made his decision. He ordered his own ship, the Hartford, and her consort, the Metacomet, to pull out of line, past the stalled Brooklyn, and steam directly across the area where the Tecumseh had just sunk.
Deliberately going over the minefield.
Deliberately. It was an incredible gamble. Mahan confirms sailors below decks reported hearing the torpedo cases scraping against the Hartford's hull, even hearing the primer mechanisms clicking.
But none of them exploded.
None of them. Farragut had likely calculated, or perhaps desperately hoped, that having been submerged for some time, many of the torpedo's primers would be corroded, or the powder dam. He risked his flagship and his own life on that chance, and it paid off. The fleet followed him through.
Once inside the bay, past the forts, what happened to the Confederate fleet?
The smaller Confederate gunboats were quickly overwhelmed or driven off by the faster Union vessels. The formidable Tennessee, however, remained. After an initial exchange, she briefly withdrew towards Fort Morgan. Farragut knew he couldn't truly control Mobile Bay while that powerful ironclad was still operational.
So he went after her.
Immediately, he signaled the fleet, "Attack the ram." What followed was less a gun battle and more a deliberate, brutal attempt by the faster wooden Union warships to physically destroy the Tennessee by ramming her.
Using wooden ships to ram an ironclad. That sounds suicidal.
It was incredibly risky. Mahan describes the USS Monongahela and then the USS Lackawanna ramming the Tennessee head-on at full speed.
Did it damage the Tennessee?
Barely. The impact was tremendous. The Monongahela smashed her iron prow and cut water, but the Tennessee's thick armor held. She sprung a small leak but wasn't seriously damaged. The wooden ships damaged themselves more than they hurt the ironclad. Farragut's own flagship Hartford then rammed the Tennessee, scraping alongside. Even point-blank broadsides from the Hartford's heavy IX-inch guns just bounced off the Tennessee's sloped casemate.
So ramming and gunfire from the wooden ships weren't working. How was she finally defeated?
It came down to the Union monitors, and that critical design flaw, the exposed steering chains. While the heavy wooden ships kept her occupied, the faster monitor USS Chickasaw managed to get into a position directly behind the Tennessee's stern.
And just hammered away at that vulnerable spot.
Relentlessly. Mahan says the Chickasaw stuck to the Tennessee like glue, sometimes only 50 yards away, pounding her stern with heavy X-inch solid shot from her turret guns. Eventually, shots severed the Tennessee's exposed rudder chains, and another damaged her smokestack, filling the casemate with fumes.
Unable to steer, blinded by smoke under constant fire.
Her commander, Admiral Franklin Buchanan, who had commanded the Virginia Merrimac at Hampton Roads, was wounded. The ship was becoming unmanageable. Facing capture with no hope of escape or victory, Buchanan finally ordered the Confederate flag struck. The surrender of the Tennessee effectively ended the Battle of Mobile Bay and sealed the fate of the port.
Okay, so Mobile Bay is largely secured by late 1864. But Mahan takes us back a bit earlier that year and further west to another major combined Army-Navy operation, the Red River Campaign in Louisiana. This seems like a campaign driven more by politics and economics than pure military strategy.
Mahan certainly implies that. There was strong political pressure, particularly from General Halleck in Washington, to establish a Union presence in Texas. And there was also a significant desire to capture large stockpiles of cotton believed to be up the Red River.
It didn't start well, though. There was a failed attempt on Sabine Pass in Texas the year before, 1863.
Right, that was a preliminary expedition, part of the Texas focus. Mahan describes the Sabine Pass attack as poorly planned, relying entirely on surprise. When the lead Union gunboats, the Sachem and Clifton, encountered unexpected fire from a small Confederate fort, they were quickly disabled and ran aground. Their capture forced the entire invasion fleet to withdraw, a complete fiasco.
So the Red River Expedition in March 1864 was the bigger push. General Nathaniel Banks led the army overland toward Shreveport, Louisiana, accompanied by Admiral Porter's powerful river fleet moving up the Red River.
Yes, Porter had a large force, including many of the veteran Mississippi ironclads, plus some newer, lighter draft turreted ironclads like the Ozark, Osage, and Neosho, designed specifically for rivers like the Red.
How did the campaign start?
Initial success seemed promising. The Army advanced, and the Navy quickly captured the Confederate defenses at Fort Donelson, which opened the lower Red River. The fleet reached Alexandria, Louisiana, without too much trouble.
But then things went wrong.
Very wrong, very quickly. The fundamental problem, as Mahan points out, was timing. They launched the expedition during the season when the Red River was known to fall rapidly, and it did. Just as Banks's army was advancing further inland, the river level started dropping precipitously.
Stranding the Navy's ships.
Exactly. Especially the heavier ironclads and transports. They got stuck above the rapids or falls at Alexandria. These weren't huge waterfalls, but rocky shallows impossible for deep draft vessels to pass at low water.
And this happened just as the army ran into trouble.
Yes. Banks's army was defeated at the Battle of Sabine Crossroads and forced into a retreat back towards Alexandria. Suddenly, you had this incredibly dangerous situation. The army falling back, potentially leaving the valuable, immobilized naval fleet trapped deep in enemy territory, exposed to Confederate attack from the riverbanks.
A potential catastrophe for the Union. Over 10 major warships and dozens of transports stuck.
Yes, the core of Porter's fighting fleet was trapped above the Alexandria Rapids. Getting them out became the absolute priority. The situation looked desperate.
But salvation came from an unexpected source, an Army engineer.
Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bailey. He was actually chief engineer for the 99th Army Corps, serving with Banks's army. He had experience as a lumberman in Wisconsin and proposed a radical idea. Build dams across the Red River to artificially raise the water level over the rapids, enough to let the fleet escape.
Build dams across a major river under potential enemy fire with retreating Army troops. That sounds almost impossible.
It was an extraordinary feat of field engineering. Mahan describes it in detail. Bailey didn't have proper materials, so he improvised. He got thousands of soldiers, including skilled lumbermen regiments from Maine and New York, working around the clock.
What kind of dams did they build?
They built large cribs from logs, filled them with stones, bricks, anything heavy they could find. They even dismantled nearby sugar houses for material and sank them in the river. On one side, where timber was plentiful, they built a tree dam, felling huge trees and anchoring them with the branches facing downstream to catch sediment and slow the water. The river there was over 750 feet wide, with a swift current.
How long did this take?
Incredibly. Mahan says they got the main structures built in about 8 working days, a monumental effort under immense pressure.
Did it work? Did it raise the water level enough?
It did. The water level behind the dams rose significantly, but the passage itself was incredibly dramatic and dangerous.
The dam broke.
Partially. The immense pressure of the backed-up water eventually swept away 2 of the central stone-filled barges that formed part of the main dam, creating a sudden, violent surge of water through the gap.
I fled through the breach. What did Porter do?
He seized the moment. Seeing the water level temporarily high enough in the channel but dropping fast, he immediately ordered the lightest draft gunboat, the veteran timber-clad Lexington, to make a run for it.
Through that narrow gap with water roaring through.
Exactly. Mahan describes the Lexington gathering steam, plunging into the 66-foot-wide gap, being tossed about violently by the torrent, scraping the rocks below, but somehow making it through the rapids with 2 or 3 heavy rolls into the deeper water below.
Must have been terrifying to watch, let alone experience.
Absolutely, a moment of pure adrenaline and relief. After the Lexington made it, Bailey's engineers partially closed the breach and built secondary wing dams to better control the flow and create enough depth for the heavier ironclads.
Did they all get through?
Eventually, yes. They had to lighten the remaining ships dramatically, removing armor plating, landing guns, dumping stores. But one by one, over the next few days, all the tracked vessels managed to scrape over the falls and escape downriver.
An incredible rescue. Bailey's Dam saved the fleet.
It was a masterpiece of improvisation and sheer hard work, a testament to the resourcefulness of the soldiers and sailors, and a perfect example of the Army and Navy having to work together in desperate circumstances to overcome logistical failure at a higher level. #outro.
So, reflecting on this whole deep dive, looking at Mahan's account, it really paints a picture of the Western theater as this relentless struggle defined as much by logistics, geography, and sheer improvisation as by actual battles.
Absolutely. We went from the immense, almost passive challenge of blockading 1,600 miles of difficult Gulf coastline to the incredibly active, often brutal, and highly improvised campaign to seize control of that 1,100-mile Mississippi River artery.
And we saw constant adaptation, didn't we? Starting with those makeshift wooden gunboats with oak planking.
Yeah, and moving to Eads' unique turtle ironclads, designed for head-on river fighting but dangerously vulnerable elsewhere, armed with guns that, well, sometimes exploded.
Right up to the sophisticated monitors and the powerful CSS Tennessee clashing amidst torpedoes at Mobile Bay, the technology evolved incredibly quickly under pressure.
But the human and logistical elements were always there. The devastating impact of sickness that stalled the Vicksburg campaign in '62. The absolute misery and ultimate failure of those bayou expeditions, fighting the terrain as much as the enemy.
And the constant need for engineering solutions, culminating in something like Bailey's Dam. Plus the individual acts of bravery like the Musher's crew, or Quartermaster Bois nailing the flag to the sinking Cincinnati. Discipline and courage often made the difference when technology or planning failed.
Mahan's analysis really brings home how the Union Navy essentially had to invent riverine warfare as it went along. There was no doctrine, no pre-built fleet for this kind of conflict. It led to chaotic innovation, terrible losses like the Indianola or the Cincinnati, but ultimately it produced these uniquely American victories.
Victories on the water that, as Mahan argues, were strategically decisive in dividing and crippling the Confederacy.
Without control of the rivers, the Union victory would have been far more difficult, perhaps impossible.
So thinking about this immense effort, creating this inland navy from scratch, overcoming disease, navigating treacherous waters, improvising solutions like Bailey's Dam, what's the final thought we want to leave our listeners with today?
I think it's about the nature of that victory, the sheer resourcefulness, the engineering grit, the ability to adapt and overcome massive logistical hurdles with sometimes just raw ingenuity, maybe, that was just as crucial to the Union's success as its industrial might or numbers.
That grassroots problem-solving capability.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In our modern age, we focus so much on high-tech, precision warfare, meticulously planned campaigns. Could a major conflict today still be significantly shaped or perhaps even won by that kind of sheer, desperate, on-the-fly, bottom-up innovation when the sophisticated plans inevitably encounter unexpected friction?
The provocative question indeed. Can ingenuity still overcome overwhelming challenges when the official script fails? Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.